I'm going to try to tell this without making myself sound better than I was. That's harder than it sounds, because the natural thing when you're telling a story about something that went wrong is to position yourself as the person who did their best, who tried, who couldn't have known. And I did try, and I couldn't have known some of it. But I also made choices I wouldn't make now, and I think being straight about those is the only way to tell this honestly. My name's Nora. I'm 31. I've been a wilderness EMT for 4 years, which means I have enough training to be dangerous in the specific way that people with partial expertise are dangerous. I know enough to feel confident and not always enough to justify it. I work seasonal contracts, mostly river outfitters and backcountry camp programs in the summers, and I spend my off-seasons doing what I did for free before anyone paid me for it, which is being outside in places that require effort to reach. I met Priya at a trail skills course in Brevard, North Carolina, about 18 months before any of this happened. She was a software engineer from Atlanta who'd decided in her early 30s that she wanted to learn to be competent in the outdoors, which I respected immediately because it takes a particular kind of self-awareness to admit you want to do something and don't know how yet. A lot of people skip that admission and just go anyway, and that's when you get the calls I sometimes respond to. She was a quick learner. Careful. She asked good questions and wrote the answers down and then actually retained them, which is rarer than it should be. By the end of the course, we'd exchanged numbers. We hiked together a few times over the following year, day hikes, 1 2-night trip in the Smokies that went well. When she asked me last October if I'd do a 5-day section of the AT with her, Neil's Gap up through the Nantahala, I said yes because I wanted to go and because I trusted her skills and because I thought I knew her. I think I did know her. I'm still not sure the knowing was enough. The first 2 days were good. She'd trained for the mileage and it showed. She set a steady pace, managed her energy well, didn't push too hard on the ascents. We got along easily in the way you do with someone you've chosen to spend time with, specifically because the easy part comes naturally. We cooked together and talked in the evenings, and I slept well both nights. The morning of day 3, I noticed the first thing. We'd camped at a flat site near a gap south of UNTOLD and had agreed to an early start. I was up first, which was unusual. Priya was normally moving before me. I got the stove going and sat there with my water heating and waited. After a while, I looked at her tent. The zipper was open about 6 inches. Her boots were outside the tent door the way you leave them when you're inside and not planning to go anywhere. But the tent had that particular stillness that means no one's in it. I walked over and unzipped it the rest of the way. Sleeping bag, sleeping pad, pack, everything. Phone on the ground sheet, powered off. Phone on the ground sheet. I turned around and looked at the tree line in every direction and called her name twice. She came out of the trees about 40 yards south of camp, moving at a normal walk, no urgency, tucking her fleece back into her waistband. She'd gone to use the bathroom. She'd left her phone behind because she never took it for that. I was completely aware that this was the explanation, and I watched my own reaction carefully because that's the habit. Assess, don't catastrophize. Her face was normal when she saw me. She said good morning and asked how the water was coming. I said almost ready. I watched her for the rest of that morning and told myself I was watching because that's what I do and not because anything was actually wrong. We reached UNTOLD around midday and ate lunch at the observation tower, sitting on the stone steps with the wind coming from the northwest and the mountains going on until they didn't. Priya was quieter than the previous 2 days. Not withdrawn. She responded when I talked to her, asked questions, laughed at the right moments. But the part of her that usually ran a little ahead of the conversation, making connections and following tangents, that part had gone somewhere else. I asked if she was doing okay. She said she was great, just tired. The mileage was accumulating. I accepted it because it was reasonable. Mileage does accumulate. We pushed on to the Waya shelter for the night, arriving in the early evening with enough time to set up properly and get water and eat before dark. There were 2 other hikers at the shelter, a father and son doing a section together, friendly enough, who turned in early. Priya and I sat outside for a while after dinner, and I tried to find the conversational thread from the previous nights, and it was there, but it had changed texture. Thinner. Like something was using up a portion of her attention, and what I was getting was what was left. I asked her once more if everything was all right. She looked at the dark past the shelter and said, "I've been thinking about something. Something that happened before the trip." I waited. She said, "I'll tell you when we get to Fontana. I want to think about how to say it first." I said okay. I meant it. I know how to give people room. She went to her tent around the same time as the father and son. I stayed up another 20 minutes, looking at the stars through the shelter opening, and then I went to sleep. I woke up because my body told me to. No sound, no specific stimulus that I could identify. Just awake, suddenly and completely, at a time I estimated as somewhere past midnight but before the sky started to lighten. I lay still and listened the way I'd learned to do in years of camping, running the inventory of sounds. Wind, moderate, from the same northwest direction. Leaves. A branch somewhere under intermittent load, creaking with the gusts. And Priya's tent was unzipping. Very slowly. The kind of slow that isn't insomnia, isn't urgency, isn't a bathroom trip. The measured, deliberate slowness of someone trying not to make a sound. I watched through the gap in my sleeping bag as her tent door folded back, and she came out on her hands and knees, already wearing her jacket and her boots. She'd dressed inside the tent. She had her headlamp on her head, but it was off. She stood up and stood still for a moment, and even in the dark and from 20 feet away, I could see her head move as she scanned the area. She didn't look at my tent. That was the thing that put my heart in my throat. She looked everywhere around camp before she moved, and she was being quiet enough that she didn't know I was awake, and she didn't look at my tent once. She walked north on the trail, without her pack, without her poles. I sat up. I want to be accurate about what happened in my body in the next 30 seconds, because it's relevant. It wasn't fear, not exactly, not the kind with a clear object. It was the feeling of a pattern assembling itself from pieces that had been lying around for 2 days, and the pattern being something I didn't want to have seen. My hands did this thing they do sometimes at work when I'm running a scenario assessment, and the scenario is going somewhere bad. They get very steady. The rest of me goes a little cold, and my hands get very steady, and I work from that. I put on my boots and my headlamp and my jacket, and I followed her. The trail from Waya Shelter runs north along the ridge before it starts descending. She was maybe 60 yards ahead of me when I came out of camp, visible as a dark shape against the slightly lighter dark of the open ridge. Moving at a pace that wasn't lost, deliberate and directed, like she knew where she was going. I followed her for maybe a quarter mile. She stopped at a place where a short side trail branches west to a viewpoint, a bare, rocky promontory that looks out over the Nantahala drainage. She turned off the main trail onto the side trail without hesitating. I stopped on the main trail. I knew this viewpoint. I'd been there years before. It's a beautiful spot in daylight and a specific kind of vertiginous drop in the dark, the land falling away sharply below the rocks. I called her name. She stopped. Her silhouette, 20 feet down the side trail, went very still. I said her name again, normally, not loud, and said I was behind her. She turned around slowly. She stood there on the trail in the dark, and I couldn't see her face, and neither of us said anything for what felt like a long time but was probably 15-20 seconds. Then she said, "How did you know I was gone?" Her voice was completely normal. A little flat, maybe. She said it the way you ask a straightforward question about a thing you're genuinely curious about. I said I woke up. She said, "I didn't want to wake you." I said I knew. I walked down the side trail to where she was standing and stood next to her. The viewpoint was another 10 yards further, and we were both facing it and not going toward it and not talking about it. I asked her to come back to camp. She said, "I need to tell you the thing I said I'd tell you at Fontana." I said she could tell me right there, and she did. I'm not going to put it here in full because it's hers and not mine, and she's still navigating it, but the condensed version is this. 3 months before the trip, she'd been diagnosed with something that carries a significant long-term prognosis and that she hadn't told anyone about, including her family, including me. She'd planned the trip partly as a way of putting herself somewhere that required her whole physical attention, somewhere the diagnosis couldn't follow her into the hours the same way it followed her everywhere else. It had followed her anyway. That's what day 3 had been. The following. I don't know what she would have done at the viewpoint. I've thought about it more times than I can count, and I don't have a clean answer. She's told me since that she doesn't know either. She says she was just walking, and when she got there, she would have figured out what came next. I don't fully believe that, and I think she knows I don't. But I also know that belief and knowledge are different instruments, and sometimes you have to let someone else choose which one to use. We sat on the trail together for a long time, not at the viewpoint. On the trail, 10 yards back, in the cold, and she talked, and I listened, and I didn't do the EMT thing of assessing and intervening. I just listened. It's the hardest thing I know how to do. We hiked out the next morning. Day 4 and 5 didn't happen. I called my car a ride share from a forest road access point near the NOC, and we drove back to Brevard together, and I made her call her sister from my kitchen table before I let her leave. She's in treatment now. Real treatment, with people who are better equipped for it than I am. We still talk, regularly. She asked me a few months ago if I was angry at her for not telling me before the trip. I said no, which was true, and I said that wasn't really what I was still sitting with. She asked what I was sitting with. I said I kept thinking about the way she'd checked the camp before she moved, looking in every direction, looking everywhere except my tent. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't want you to try to stop me." I asked if she meant generally, or that night specifically. She said she wasn't sure there was a difference. I think about that a lot, about the distance between those two things and whether they're actually two things at all. I don't have a resolution for it. I've stopped looking for one. What I have instead is her phone number, which I have memorized, and which I check the activity on more than I probably should. She's always there. I have a bad habit of overpacking information. My wife calls it the debrief problem. I'll come back from a grocery run and give her a full account of the parking lot situation, the checkout line, the particular way the self-checkout machine rejected my loyalty card twice before accepting it on the 3rd try. I don't know why I do it. I think I find comfort in sequence. If I can lay out what happened in the right order, it feels like I understand it. My therapist says this is a coping mechanism for anxiety. My wife says it's just annoying. They're both probably right. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what follows is me trying very hard to tell a story in order and failing in places. And the places where I fail are the places that still don't sit right. My name's not important. What's relevant is that I'm 43. I'm a high school geography teacher in Asheville, and I've been doing solo section hikes on the AT for about 9 years. I know this trail, not the whole thing. I've done maybe 400 miles of it in pieces, but I know how it works. I know the shelter system. I know the register culture. I know the informal etiquette. I'm not someone who makes rookie mistakes. I want that on record before I tell you what happened, because some of what I did, in retrospect, was not smart. And I've had to make peace with the fact that knowing better doesn't always mean doing better when you're scared and alone, and it's the middle of the night in the Nantahala National Forest. This was 3 weeks ago. I was doing a 4-night section between Wesser and Fontana Dam, a stretch I'd been planning for 2 years and kept postponing because life is what it is. My wife dropped me at the Nantahala Outdoor Center at first light on a Monday. She kissed me goodbye and told me not to do anything stupid and drove away, and I stood in the parking lot in the cold with my pack and felt the particular relief of someone who is about to be unreachable for 4 days. That feeling lasted until the second night. The first day was straightforward. The climb out of Wesser is brutal. It earns its reputation, a relentless grade for the first couple miles that had me stopping more than I wanted to. But once you're on the ridge, the terrain moderates and the views open up and you remember why you do this. I reached the campsite I'd planned for, a designated site called Sassafras Gap, in the late afternoon. Set up my tent, filtered water from a spring 50 yards down a side trail, ate, wrote in my journal, went to sleep before dark the way you do when you've been on your feet for 8 hours. Nothing unusual. Good day. I slept well. Day 2 was when it started, and I want to be precise about the sequence. I broke camp around first light and was moving by the time the sun was fully up. The trail through that section runs along a ridge before dropping into a gap and climbing again. And in the morning light, it was the kind of hiking that makes you feel specifically lucky to be alive and outside. I was maybe 2 miles from the previous night's camp when I passed another hiker going southbound. This happens all the time. You nod. Sometimes you stop and exchange information about conditions ahead. Sometimes you just pass. It's a culture of brief, functional friendliness. This man stopped. He was older, somewhere in his 60s, I'd guess, lean in the way people get after a lot of trail time, with a pack that was too lightly loaded for a multi-day trip. He had a quality of stillness when he stopped that I noticed, but didn't flag. Some hikers are just still. It's a physical discipline you develop. He asked if I was headed to Fontana. I said yes. He asked if I was planning to camp at Cold Spring Shelter the following night. I said probably yes, that was the plan. He nodded like I'd confirmed something. He said the shelter was in good shape. Water source was running clean, no issues. He said it in the tone of someone delivering a report. Then he said, "You started at Wesser Monday morning." It wasn't a question. I said yes, that was right. He said, "Figured. Have a good hike," and started walking south. I stood there for a second before I started moving again. I told myself he'd probably seen me at the NOC that morning. Maybe he'd been there. Maybe he'd noticed my start. Trailheads are small communities. People observe. I filed it under explicable and kept walking. I've been a geography teacher for 16 years. I know how to rationalize spatial information. I did it then, very efficiently, and I want to be honest about that. I reached the Cold Spring Shelter area by late afternoon and found the site that the shelter register listed as Campsite 7, a flat area maybe 80 yards from the main shelter, more private than the designated spots closer in. I prefer distance from shelter common areas when I'm solo. Nothing against the social scene, I just sleep better without other people's bear hangs crashing into mine at odd hours. I set up, ate, did the usual. The shelter register was in a box at the main structure, and I walked over to sign in before dark. Standard practice. You write your name, your start point, your destination, the date. I paged back through the recent entries out of habit. You do this partly for information, conditions notes, water source updates, and partly just because trail registers have a particular texture of human honesty that I find interesting. The entry 2 above mine stopped me. It was dated that day. The handwriting was neat, almost architectural in its precision, the kind of handwriting that takes effort. It said, "Southbound. Good conditions north to Fontana. Campsite 7 occupied tonight. Solo. Teacher from Asheville. 4 nights wesser to Fontana." That was it. No name. No trail name. Nothing else. I read it 3 times. My mouth went dry in the specific way it does when I'm trying to stay calm and my body isn't cooperating. I took out my phone and photographed the entry. Then I walked back to my tent and stood outside it for a while, looking at the tree line, not really thinking in words. Here's what I kept getting stuck on, and still get stuck on. The entry said teacher from Asheville. I hadn't told that man on the trail what I did for a living. I hadn't told him where I lived. I'd said I started at Wesser. I said I was going to Fontana, and he'd said have a good hike and walked away. So either he knew me from somewhere I couldn't place, or he'd written that entry before we spoke, which meant he already knew those things, which meant something else entirely that I didn't want to look at directly. I didn't sleep much. I won't dress that up. I lay in my tent and listened to every sound the forest made and cataloged each one and told myself what it was, and the telling myself worked for about an hour before it stopped working. My sleeping bag was warm, but I was cold in the specific way where the temperature isn't the problem. Sometime well after midnight, I heard footsteps on the trail. Not close. On the main trail, not the spur to my campsite. Moving north toward Fontana. Deliberate pace. No headlamp that I could see through the tent fabric. They passed and didn't slow and were gone in maybe 30 seconds. I didn't sleep again before morning. I broke camp at first light and pushed hard. I covered the next day's planned mileage by early afternoon and kept going, and I reached Fontana Dam a full day ahead of schedule. My wife picked me up in the parking lot and I got in the car, and I didn't say anything for about 10 minutes. She knows me well enough to let that happen. I reported the register entry to the Park Service and gave them the photograph. The ranger I spoke with wrote everything down and said they'd look into it. He had the professional neutrality of someone receiving information he wasn't sure what to do with. He asked if I'd felt physically threatened. I said no. He said they'd follow up. I haven't heard back. I've shown the photograph to 4 people. My wife, my therapist, a colleague who does a lot of backcountry hiking, and a ranger friend I know from a previous trail incident several years ago. All 4 of them have the same response. They study it for a while, and then they look at me, and then they say some version of the same thing, which is that they can't explain it either. My therapist says the mind seeks pattern and sometimes finds it where it doesn't exist. She says it's possible I mentioned more to the man than I remember. Trail conversations are casual, information slips out without tracking. I know that. I know that's true. But I'm a geography teacher. I tell people where things are for a living. I know what I said and what I didn't say, and I know the difference between mentioning a trailhead and telling a stranger my occupation and my city, and exactly where I plan to sleep that night. The thing I come back to, the thing I can't put down, is the handwriting. That precise, architectural handwriting. Deliberate. The writing of someone who intended to be read. not a note to himself. A note that was placed in a public register because it was meant to be found. My wife asked me last week if I was going to do the next section in the spring. Fontana Dam up to Klingman's Dome, a stretch I've been wanting to do for years. I said I was thinking about it. I am thinking about it. I'm thinking about it the way you think about something you're going to do, despite the fact that part of you is arguing clearly against it, and you already know which part is going to win, and the knowing doesn't make the argument any quieter. I thru-hiked the AT 3 years ago. Did the whole thing, Georgia to Maine, about 5 months start to finish. I've told people the hike changed me, which is true, but not always in the ways I mean when I say it out loud. The stretch I'm going to talk about was somewhere in Western Virginia, past the Damascus area. I was about 6 weeks in at that point. The trail had thinned out, spring rush was over, and you'd go a full day without seeing another northbounder. I was sleeping in my tent instead of shelters because it had been raining, and wet shelter floors aren't worth the company. I set up camp on a flat ridge off-trail, maybe 80 feet from the blazed path. Nothing unusual about the spot. I'd picked sites like it dozens of times. Good drainage, no dead overhead branches, enough tree cover to keep the wind off. I cooked my dinner, hung my food bag, and was in my sleeping bag by 8:30. I woke up at some point in the night because I heard something moving outside. My first thought was deer. You hear deer constantly on the AT. They're less afraid of people than you'd expect, and they move through camp like they own it. I lay there and listened. The sound was slow, deliberate. Whatever it wasn't browsing. It was walking in a way that didn't vary, like it had a destination. I told myself it was a person. Hikers walk at night sometimes. Night hiking is a legitimate strategy in hot weather. The footsteps were roughly the right cadence for a person moving carefully in the dark. But they didn't continue past camp. They stopped. And then I heard them again from a slightly different direction, like whoever it was had circled to the other side. I unzipped my bag and sat up. I had a headlamp on my wrist. I didn't turn it on. I've read enough accounts, not horror stories. I mean actual accounts from park rangers and long-distance hikers, to know that turning on a light when you don't know what's out there tells the outside world exactly where you are and takes away your night vision in one move. So I sat in the dark and listened. The sound stopped. I waited maybe 10 minutes. Nothing. I told myself it had been an animal, or a late hiker who'd gone on, or my own half-asleep brain threading random noise into a pattern. I lay back down. At some point I fell asleep again, because I woke up to gray pre-dawn light and my tent walls were wet with condensation, and I felt fine. I packed up slowly, heated water for coffee, ate a bar, and didn't think much about the night before. About 2 miles up the trail, I passed a guy going southbound. We did the usual nod, and he stopped and asked if I'd camped on the ridge back there. I said yeah. He said he'd seen a tent there the night before, around midnight, when he came through with his headlamp on. I said I'd heard someone pass through. He looked at me kind of carefully and said he hadn't passed through. He'd stopped because he saw the tent and didn't want to spook whoever was sleeping. He'd turned his lamp off and waited. And when he finally moved on, about 10 minutes later, there was a man standing at the tree line on the far side of my camp. Just standing there, facing the tent. The southbounder said he'd thought maybe it was another hiker taking a leak. But the man hadn't moved, and he hadn't had any gear that the southbounder could see. No pack, no headlamp, no jacket. We stood on the trail and didn't say much for a second. He asked if I was okay. I told him I hadn't seen anyone. He nodded like that was the right answer and not the wrong one, and we went our separate directions. I didn't camp off trail again for 3 weeks. I stuck to shelters, even the wet ones. I told myself it was nothing. Someone out for a night walk, a local, a hunter who'd come up from a road. There are roads that cross near the trail in that section. It's not wilderness the way people picture it. I finished the hike, made it to Katahdin in September, took the picture, cried a little like everybody does. But I've thought about that night more than I've thought about most of the hike. I've thought about the way the footsteps circled. I've thought about what the southbounder said, that the man was just standing there, facing the tent, not moving. I've thought about the fact that whatever he was doing out there, he was doing it quietly enough that I heard nothing until I was already asleep. I don't know what he wanted. I'm glad I don't. Glad I